The cold morning fog clung to the pier like a second skin. Gulls circled above, screeching against the low hum of the harbor's stirring life. At the far end of Pier 7, the USS Horn loomed with quiet majesty, its aging hull catching slivers of dull silver from the dawn light. The towering mast jutted against the sky, casting a long, skeletal shadow over the wooden planks below. James P. Donovan stood at the foot of the ramp, motionless, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn peacoat. His eyes didn't blink. They drank in every line, every rusted plate, every memory carved into that ship's steel. A voice sliced through the stillness. "Sir, this ship doesn't take tourists." A young officer in crisp uniform blocked the path. He didn't raise his voice, but the tone was firm, the kind used to shut down questions before they could form. Behind him, active-duty sailors filed past, ignoring the exchange entirely. One brushed James's shoulder without a glance. It was like he wasn't even there. James didn't argue. He took a slow step back, gaze never leaving the ship. The Horn. His ship. Every bolt in her frame had once been in his care. Her systems had once trusted him more than any manual ever could. He'd lived below deck, worked through storms, fixed what others had given up on. Now, to them, he was nothing but an old man loitering near the base of a restricted ramp. He swallowed, lips pressed tight. His hand drifted to his coat pocket, feeling the folded paper inside, a worn document, a last-ditch attempt. But he didn't reach for it. Not yet. He just stood there, the cold seeping through his shoes, as the ship that had once been his life sat impassive, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to remember him. James Donovan had always been a man of habit. His days unfolded with the same quiet rhythm: wake at 6, shower, brew coffee, toast a slice of bread, and sit by the window to watch the city stir to life. From that modest third-floor apartment in Norfolk, he could just see the tip of the marina's massed forest on clear days, silver needles rising from the docks like sentinels. The same walk to the marina, the same coffee in a travel mug with the faded Navy emblem, the same nods to fellow dock workers who never asked too many questions. James liked it that way. Routine was comfort, especially for a man who had once lived by the unpredictability of the sea. But nothing in his quiet routine compared to the years he had spent aboard the Horn. He'd joined the Navy at 22, a scrappy recruit with a mechanical mind and no patience for red tape. It wasn't long before they recognized his talent. He had a way of listening to machines the way others listened to people. When he was first assigned to the USS Horn, she was already considered aging but reliable. Others saw a rusting warship, James saw a living thing that needed care. While officers rotated and departments shifted, James stayed. 23 years. He'd worked his way up through grit, not politics, and had earned the unofficial title of Horn's Heartbeat. Everyone from ensigns to executive officers came to him when things started acting up. His hands remembered her body, the auxiliary generator under the main deck, the serpentine tangle of pipes near the aft engine compartment, the groan she made when the cooling system hit 68% load. He used to say he could tell the weather by the way she vibrated. In typhoons, in dry dock, in simulated strikes, James was there, patching her up, recalibrating her soul. When her systems evolved with new tech, James evolved too, teaching himself software diagnostics with the same patience he once used on diesel engines. But ships, like men, aren't built to last forever. The Horn was finally decommissioned just past her 50th birthday. There'd been a small ceremony, modest, quiet. James hadn't said a word through most of it. His ship was going silent, and there wasn't a wrench in the world that could stop that. Civilian life hit like cold water. James found work at the Norfolk Marina, mostly repairing leisure boats and the occasional charter vessel. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept his hands busy. He didn't talk much to customers, preferring to work alone. The younger mechanics respected him, though none could quite get close. James didn't let them. His apartment became something of a personal museum. On a chipped bookshelf sat a navy blue mug with the Horn's crest, cracked but still usable. Above it, a yellowed photograph in a frame, a younger James standing with 4 shipmates, all grease-streaked and grinning in front of an open engine panel. And next to the photo, a scratched bronze plaque, USS Horn, the Indomitable, for service beyond expectation. It had been handed to him at his retirement, accompanied by words he barely remembered. What stayed with him was the feel of the ship as he walked her corridors one last time, whispering a private goodbye as if she could hear him. Years passed. James remained steady, a fixture at the marina. But some days, especially the gray ones, when the air was thick with salt and memory, he found his mind drifting back. He'd lean on the railing, coffee in hand, and stare out at the sea, wondering if she still sat out there in some dry dock, if her decks were being walked by ghosts. Sometimes, he dreamed he was back below deck, flashlight clamped between his teeth, the scent of engine oil and ozone thick in the air. He'd wake up with aching hands and a tightness in his chest that wasn't fear or sorrow but longing. Then came the notice. It was posted on the bulletin board in the marina office, wedged between a flyer for a boating safety seminar and an ad for a used outboard motor. Printed in standard Navy formatting, it was brief. USS Horn to be recommissioned as a tactical support and training vessel. All inquiries through official command channels. Unauthorized access prohibited. James stared at it for a long time. The ink blurred slightly as his breath hit the paper. They were bringing her back. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just folded the notice and tucked it into his pocket. That night, he sat at his small kitchen table, poring over old binders, diagrams, and maintenance logs. He found the old engineer's credentials, yellowed but intact. The next morning, he shaved close, dug out the coat he hadn't worn in years, and made his way down to Pier 7. It felt like stepping back in time. When the Horn came into view, she looked older, her paint weathered and her silhouette heavier. But to James, she was magnificent. He knew every curve of her structure, every antenna, every cable run hidden behind her skin. Her mast still stood proud, a monument to battles fought and lives carried. He approached the ramp with quiet reverence. The officers moved briskly, heads down, efficient. None recognized him. Why would they? To them, he was just another old-timer who probably told tall tales over beers. Then came the voice. Young, clipped, dismissive. "Sir, this ship doesn't take tourists." The words hit harder than he expected. Not because of the tone, but because of the assumption. He wasn't a tourist. He was crew. He had been more than that, he had been the ship in some ways. He didn't argue. Instead, he took the small folder from his pocket, copies of his maintenance logs, old authorization tags, the notice from the board, and slid them back in, untouched. His pride, battered but intact, would not let him beg. The Navy had trained him to keep moving, to improvise, adapt, overcome. But this? This was something else. As he turned from the ramp, he looked back one last time at the Horn. A gust of wind pushed a corner of the notice up from his coat. He caught it before it slipped away. A fleeting thought crossed his mind, they've forgotten me. And yet, the ship remained. Steel didn't forget. Systems didn't forget. They simply waited. He would too. James didn't sleep much the night after they turned him away. He sat at the edge of his bed, the notice still in his hand, his fingers slowly folding and unfolding it until the creases became sharp enough to slice. His coffee sat untouched on the windowsill as dawn broke, the morning light filtering through yellowed blinds. Somewhere far off, the horns of the harbor echoed, one of the newer carriers coming in, maybe. But he didn't care. All he could think about was the look on that officer's face, McConnell, he'd learned from a name tag. Sharp jaw, sharper eyes, the kind that measured everything in protocol and paperwork. James had met that type before. Hell, he'd trained a few. Still, this cut deeper than expected. He didn't blame McConnell, not entirely. The Navy had changed. Everything had. What once was memory had become archive, and archive had become obsolete. And in that transformation, people like James had vanished between the lines. But that didn't mean they were gone. 3 days later, the marina buzzed with news. Someone had spotted the Horn conducting preliminary tactical readiness drills right there in the bay. James, who had already guessed this would be the case, said nothing. He simply looked up from the bench where he was working on a motor, eyes squinting toward the horizon. She was there. Not far. And not ready. He knew the Horn. She wasn't built for training exercises. Not without adjustments. Her systems were old, complex, dependent on specific redundancies that, if skipped or misunderstood, would spiral into failure. The Navy had modernized a lot since her decommissioning, but James doubted they'd taken the time to truly understand what they were bringing back to life. Reactivating her wasn't like firing up a computer. It was more like waking a sleeping animal, one that remembered who fed her and who didn't. That night, James pulled his old logbooks from a plastic storage bin under his bed. Each one was dog-eared, smudged with grease and time, their pages covered in handwritten notes, schematics, and system idiosyncrasies the manuals never captured. He reviewed diagrams of the propulsion system, the cooling loop redundancies, the auxiliary power conduits, all of it etched into his memory. And that's when he saw it. An error. It was small, but vital. The portside auxiliary cooling panel, a notoriously temperamental system, was marked on his schematics as needing a manual override each time the ship was restarted after a full system shutdown. If it wasn't reset with a very specific sequence, the entire engine's secondary system could stall under pressure. Worse, the sensors wouldn't flag the issue until it was too late. To anyone new, it might look like a minor anomaly, unless they'd lived with it, like James had. The next morning, James returned to Pier 7. He kept his distance this time, watching from behind a row of storage containers near the base of the loading area. Through a narrow gap, he could see the deck clearly. Technicians moved with purpose, checking panels, nodding into headsets. James's eyes tracked one in particular, a man working near the cooling units. From the angle and rhythm of his movements, James could tell, he was struggling. Probably didn't understand the system. Probably about to make it worse. James approached, not quickly, not aggressively. Just a calm walk, one hand holding his folder of schematics. "Excuse me," he said. "You're about to." "I'm working, sir," the technician cut in. "Please step back." James kept his voice level. "I was on the Horn for 23 years. That panel you're working on? If you don't reset the manual override first, it'll stall out under the next load." The technician straightened, giving him a hard look. "This area is restricted. You need to leave." James sighed and turned, only to find McConnell standing a few paces away. "Persistent, aren't you?" the officer said. He wasn't shouting, but his voice had a bite. "I thought I made myself clear last time." James held out the folder. "I'm not here to interfere. But you've got a fault in your cooling loop. One that isn't going to show up until your next high-power trial run. When it does, you'll be in the dark. This," he tapped the folder, "can save you time. Maybe more." McConnell didn't take it. He nodded at the nearby MP, escorted him off the pier. James didn't resist. He handed the folder to the security guard instead. "Give it to whoever reviews your logs," he said softly. "If they're smart, they'll read it." Back at the marina, word spread quickly. Some of the younger techs who looked up to James were confused, even angry. "Why won't they listen to you?" one asked. James didn't answer. He just kept working on the outboard engine in front of him. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, he caught himself staring again, at nothing in particular, just the way the fading light hit the bay. A cold silence settled in his chest. The next day, he wrote a letter. It wasn't formal. Just a personal note addressed to the commanding officer of the Horn, outlining what he knew, what he'd seen, and what would likely happen. He mailed it, not expecting a reply. He just couldn't let himself walk away completely. Not when he knew the ship, and her crew, were heading straight toward failure. A week passed. Then 2. No reply. No acknowledgement. Then, during a gray Thursday afternoon, the news broke. System failure aboard the Horn. It happened during a high-speed maneuver trial. The auxiliary cooling unit failed to engage during the final leg of the run. As predicted, the backup systems failed to compensate. Power to the propulsion grid was cut for 37 minutes. No one was hurt, but the embarrassment was severe. The Horn had to be towed back to the dock under external power. James heard it on the radio while changing a fuel filter. He froze. Not in satisfaction. Not in anger. Just that quiet ache again, that terrible knowledge that he'd been right. That he'd tried. That no one had listened. Later that night, he sat on his balcony, the letter still on his mind. He wondered if it had ever reached the captain. He doubted it. Paper, like people, got lost. Forgotten. Disregarded. And yet, as the lights of the harbor flickered to life, James still felt the hum of the Horn inside him. Her pain was his pain. Her silence, his burden. The Navy might not remember him. But the ship did. The morning after the failure, James walked to the end of the breakwater path that jutted past the marina's edge. From there, he could see Pier 7 clearly. The Horn sat docked once again, her once proud silhouette now slightly stooped, as if embarrassed by her own breakdown. There was no movement on deck, at least none visible from this distance, but James didn't need binoculars to know what was happening aboard. Meetings. Blame. A scramble to identify causes and isolate faults. He'd been there before, back when he wore a uniform and answers were demanded before respect was given. He didn't go down to the pier that day. Or the next. Instead, he watched. A silent witness, positioned just far enough not to be noticed but close enough to see. The uniformed crew resumed their duties by the third day, but something in their rhythm had changed. There was hesitation in their steps, a tightness in formation drills, tension clinging to their every movement like the coastal mist. Among them, James spotted McConnell. The officer moved briskly, head low, jaw tight. His posture hadn't changed, still squared shoulders, still regulation-perfect stride, but his eyes darted more. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was calculating. Evaluating. Good, James thought. Let the man feel what it's like when the lines on the page don't match the bolts in the steel. James didn't blame him entirely. Youth didn't teach humility, it was learned, earned, sometimes at a cost. And from what James could see, McConnell was paying. Late that afternoon, James noticed activity near the aft maintenance bay. A small team in coveralls clustered around an open panel, the same one James had warned them about. He narrowed his eyes, watching their gestures, reading the frustration in their body language. The technician from before was back, his stance uncertain, tools clutched too tightly. Something wasn't right. Again. James waited until the team dispersed, then began the long walk to Pier 7. He wasn't thinking about how he would be received. He wasn't even planning what to say. All he knew was that the ship, the Horn, was in trouble. And if no one else could see it, then he would speak again, consequences be damned. He reached the perimeter fence and leaned against the chain link, just outside the security zone. A few junior officers eyed him warily, but none approached. James simply pointed toward the open panel, then tapped his wrist as if to say time's running out. Whether they understood or not didn't matter. He stayed there for an hour, unmoving. It wasn't long before McConnell came down. This time, the young officer didn't come with authority brimming in his voice. His steps were slower, his jaw tight but not clenched. James turned to face him as he approached. "You again," McConnell said. The words weren't angry. Just tired. James nodded. The panel's still misaligned. Whoever's running diagnostics is skipping the thermal recalibration step. You're going to get a false clear. Then it'll lock mid-cycle. McConnell stared at him. "You said that last time. And I was right." A beat passed. Wind stirred the edge of McConnell's jacket. For a moment, James thought the officer might offer some kind of apology. But instead, McConnell said, "Why didn't you press harder?" James raised an eyebrow. "I did. You weren't listening." McConnell looked away, jaw flexing. "We're running a revalidation drill tomorrow. No room for error." "Then you're already behind," James said softly. "That panel's part of your coolant failover. If it misfires under simulated stress, your internal temps will spike faster than the AI's predictive model can adjust. You'll scrub the whole drill." McConnell studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. James didn't follow. He just watched the young man disappear up the gangway, shoulders slightly lower than before. The next day, James returned early. Not to interfere. Not even to help. Just to see. Just to know. He took his usual spot at the edge of the breakwater, thermos in hand, wind in his face. The Horn shimmered under the morning sun, her steel glinting with a kind of defiant pride. James could almost feel her pulse, as if her engines were holding their breath. For hours, he sat motionless, watching sailors scurry across the deck, preparing for the drill. Through a break in the ship's side railings, he saw McConnell conferring with another officer, gesturing toward a printed sheet in his hands. James didn't need to see the details. He knew that sheet. It had come from the folder he handed to the MP. So it did reach someone, he thought. The drill commenced at noon. At first, everything moved smoothly. Then, just as James predicted, there was a hiccup. From afar, it was barely noticeable, a slight delay in the aft response, a small stagger in propulsion. But James recognized it for what it was. The system had hesitated. The override had triggered. But this time, it corrected. Whoever had reviewed his notes had acted in time. The ship righted itself and continued the drill. From the breakwater, James exhaled slowly. Not in relief, but in confirmation. As the day wound down, James stood to leave. Before he turned, he saw McConnell again, this time looking directly at him. No words. No nod. Just a glance, long and still. And in that look, James read something that hadn't been there before. Understanding. Later that evening, as the marina emptied and the sounds of the harbor settled into their familiar rhythm, James sat on the edge of the dock, legs dangling over the water. He held an old wrench in his lap, turning it slowly in his hands. The same one he'd used aboard the Horn, one of the few tools he'd been allowed to keep after retirement. He thought about the silence of the ship, the way she had endured, through time, through negligence, through misjudgment. She didn't demand attention. She didn't scream for recognition. She simply waited. And when someone listened, she answered. That night, James slept more soundly than he had in weeks. Not because he'd been proven right. But because, finally, someone had heard the Horn speak, and more importantly, they had understood her language. He wasn't angry anymore. Not at McConnell. Not at the Navy. Not even at time itself. He was simply watching. 2 days passed after the drill. James tried to return to routine, boat repairs, coffee, silence. The Horn had survived its revalidation run. The override had triggered as he'd predicted, but it had corrected itself in time. Someone had clearly read his notes. That was enough. He didn't need thanks. He just needed to know the ship would endure. Then, on the third morning, just past 8, Marina Director Griggs called across the dock. "Mr. Donovan, someone's asking for you." James stood from the boat he'd been working on, wiping his hands on a rag. 2 Navy men waited near the pier entrance. One was a young ensign. The other, McConnell. McConnell looked different. Less guarded, more deliberate. "Mr. Donovan," he began. "I've been sent to bring you to the ship. Admiral Hillard would like to speak with you." James didn't respond immediately. Hillard, that name had weight. He was a known figure, one of the last old guard commanders. If he had taken notice, then someone had finally understood what the Horn really was, and who James had been to her. "I'll come," James said simply. They walked together down the edge of the marina, past rusted buoys and tethered boats. The conversation between them remained quiet, sparse. When they reached the ramp to Pier 7, McConnell gestured. "No ID check today." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He stepped up, placing one boot on the metal ramp. The deck underfoot groaned familiarly, as if recognizing him. The sensation nearly brought tears, but he held steady. Waiting at the top was Admiral Hillard. Broad-shouldered, close-cropped gray hair, eyes like sharpened glass. His handshake was firm. "Mr. Donovan," the Admiral said. "Thank you for coming." James nodded. "You asked." "I did. After the failure, we traced the system logs and came across a folder, your folder. Once I saw your name, I checked the original maintenance archives. There you were, over 2 decades deep into this ship's bones. I had to meet the man who saw this coming." "I didn't want it to fail," James replied. "I just knew it would." "You were right," Hillard said. "And you helped avert something worse. That system correction, we used your notes. Probably saved us from a full systems wipe." "I wrote those notes 20 years ago," James said, voice quiet. "Good to know they still read." Hillard smiled slightly. "I'd like to ask a favor. Not employment. Not ceremony. Just your insight. A walk-through with our engineering staff. Help us bridge the gaps." James glanced around the deck. The same creaks, the same wind cutting through the mast. So much had changed, but the core had not. "I'll talk to them," he said after a pause. "But I'm not putting a uniform back on." "No need," Hillard replied. "They'll listen either way." They descended into the ship. The corridor lights buzzed faintly. James touched the wall as he passed, muscle memory guided him, not thought. They reached the engine bay, where a small team waited. Younger, bright-eyed, but attentive. James stepped in front of a screen. System data scrolled in real time, coolant flow, feedback loops, generator temps. He scanned it, tapped once. "There," he said. "You're 5 milliseconds off on your feedback loop relay. Not a big issue now. But under full load, you'll get thermal lag." The chief engineer blinked. "How'd you spot that so fast?" "I know the rhythm," James replied. "You don't listen with your ears on a ship like this. You listen with time." They nodded, scribbling notes. He moved through the room, pointing out small things, loose cabling routes, suboptimal startup routines, mislabeled fuses. Not criticisms, just facts. His delivery wasn't proud. Just honest. After the session, McConnell approached as the team dispersed. "They listened," he said quietly. James nodded. "The ship speaks. You just have to know her voice." McConnell hesitated. "I owe you an apology. I dismissed you before I knew who you were. I didn't understand." James studied him. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. It's not about me. It's about the Horn." McConnell exhaled. "Still. I'm sorry." James nodded once. "Then listen better next time." The Admiral escorted him topside. As they stepped back onto the deck, Hillard extended his hand again. "Thank you, Mr. Donovan." "I didn't do this for thanks," James said. "I did it because I had to. You could have stayed silent." "I tried that once," James replied. "Didn't sit right." As he walked down the ramp, the sun began to sink behind the cranes in the harbor. James didn't look back at the ship. He didn't need to. The old girl was ready now. She had people watching her. Listening. And she had spoken. James stood at the far end of Pier 7, his hands folded behind his back, the wind tugging gently at his collar. It was 2:57 p.m. The Horn's final systems revalidation would begin at 3 o'clock sharp. Unlike last time, no one blocked his path. He wasn't questioned. He wasn't asked to wait. McConnell had arranged everything. More importantly, no one looked at him as if he didn't belong. And that meant more to James than he'd ever admit. At precisely 3 o'clock, the gangway clattered as McConnell descended. His cap was tucked beneath his arm, his expression open, expectant. "We're ready if you are." James didn't move at first. He looked up at the ship. The afternoon sun struck her hull at just the right angle, casting sharp shadows along the plating. She looked stronger now. Awake. He gave a small nod, then followed McConnell aboard. The deck crew greeted him with polite respect. Some saluted, unsure of the protocol for a civilian in boots older than they were. James offered no salute in return, just a slight tip of the head. He wasn't here as a soldier. He was here as part of the Horn, the part that never decommissioned. They led him down to Central Systems Control. The room was bustling, officers at terminals, engineers hunched over screens, voices low and focused. The air carried the slight tang of ozone and fresh weld, two smells James had once called home. Admiral Hillard waited at the far end of the control bay. "Welcome back, Mr. Donovan," he said as James entered. James offered a simple, "afternoon." Without preamble, the Admiral gestured toward the main console. "Would you care to oversee final alignment?" James stepped forward. The monitors displayed a live schematic of the ship, every critical function, from propulsion to targeting calibration, tracked in real time. Colored bars flickered, oscillating as the ship adjusted to baseline thresholds. He scanned the readings. Thermal variance, tight. Coolant loops, balanced. Feedback delay, recalibrated, just as he'd advised. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "She's ready." McConnell stepped forward. "We'll begin live simulation in 60 seconds. James moved aside. He wasn't here to command. He was here to watch. The countdown began. At 0, the simulation kicked off. Warning tones sounded, internal, controlled. The ship's system sprang to life. Lights blinked across the board as simulated stress was applied. The propulsion array ramped up. Environmental control adjusted to mimic combat strain. Backup power spun into readiness. James felt it all through the floor. The deep, pulsing hum of machinery, rhythmic, healthy. The Horn was alive. For 20 straight minutes, the systems were tested in waves. James caught a brief glitch in the auxiliary fuel stabilizer curve, but it corrected within seconds. No shutdowns. No emergency failsafes. The entire ship moved like a creature stretching after a long sleep. Finally, the central monitor flashed green, test complete, status, operational. A cheer broke out. Officers clapped shoulders. A few younger sailors grinned, relief flooding their faces. McConnell exhaled and nodded at Hillard, who turned to James. "That's the cleanest run we've seen in months," the Admiral said. James gave a faint smile. She just needed to be heard. Later, Hillard invited him to the wardroom. A few senior engineers joined, along with McConnell. The room smelled of strong coffee and dry paper, a familiar Navy scent. Hillard placed a slim box on the table and slid it toward James. James hesitated before opening it. Inside was a new plaque. Brushed brass, etched with care. It read, James P. Donovan, Systems Architect Emeritus, USS Horn. The ship remembers. For a moment, the room fell quiet. James stared at the plaque, fingers tracing its edge. "I didn't come here for a plaque," he said. "I know," Hillard replied. "But we did." McConnell stood. "We're installing it just outside main engineering." James shook his head, chuckling softly. "That's where the mess table used to be. I spilled coffee there more times than I can count." "Now it'll be sacred ground," McConnell said, smiling. They talked for another hour, about ship life, the changes in modern systems, the old days when paper logs and intuition outran AI diagnostics. James didn't dominate the conversation. He didn't have to. When he spoke, everyone listened. As twilight crept in, James made his way back to the top deck. Alone now. The sky glowed gold, then purple, then navy blue. He stood by the railing, watching the harbor lights flicker on. He didn't realize McConnell had followed until he heard a voice beside him. "We're shipping out next week. Full training cycle." James nodded. "She's ready." McConnell leaned on the rail. "We could use someone like you. On call, maybe." James shook his head. "That ship's time with me has passed. You've got it now." "But she still listens to you," McConnell said. "No," James replied quietly. "She listens to anyone who bothers to learn her language." The young officer fell silent. After a while, James turned to leave. At the bottom of the gangway, he stopped, turned back, and looked one final time at the ship. Steel. Rust. Memory. He didn't need to walk her hulls again. He didn't need to tighten another bolt or adjust another thermal gauge. He had already done what was needed. Now, she sailed with new voices. New hands. But part of him would always be in her framework, hidden in the code of old logs and grease-stained notes. A quiet, indelible echo. He walked back through the darkening dock, the stars starting to blink awake overhead. No fanfare followed. No parade. Just the soft sound of waves against the pier, and the long, slow breath of a ship reborn. Legacy restored.